Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ivan Semenek. I'm the science reporter here at the Globe and Mail, and it's fallen to me to bring you back from your lunchtime conversations to be part of another interesting conversation about that fits into today's program about the future of Canada from the perspective of technology, something that I've had the pleasure of covering and writing about for the Globe. We're very eager to hear this. I'm very eager to actually to have you meet today's panelists and hear more about our topic, which has to do with life here in Canada in an AI future, maybe an AI-driven future. And you know, artificial intelligence, I'm going to just mention one quick thing, one pandemic-related story. I wrote a lot of stories about COVID-19 during the pandemic from a science perspective for the Globe. And I can tell you that AI is one of those things, you know, you write about science, there are some areas of technology people always think it's very far-fetched, it's far in the future, you know, is fusion ever going to happen? Are we ever going to, you know, get to Mars, that sort of thing. But AI is certainly with us and in the present, no longer something in the future. And it's been fascinating to watch that arc in the last 10 years as this technology has become embedded further and further in our daily life. During the pandemic, my AI experience had to do with just how rapidly I was able to turn the conversations I was having with experts, immunologists, public health officials, emergency room doctors into stories, partly because, you know, like a lot of reporters, I record my interviews, I try to take notes, but now I have a competent AI transcriber where I can throw those interviews into a computer and have them come back to me in just a matter of minutes with a full transcript, so I know exactly what the experts were telling me. And I can say that it allowed me to write faster and produce more accurate stories at a time when it was really important. I just want to mention that because so much of the AI conversation in media, not that I'm a booster of the technology, but just that so much of the AI conversation has to do with the theme of disempowerment or concerns we have, and there are many legitimate concerns to have, but there are also ways in which it's a clear enhancement and an improvement to our work, and it was just one example. In fact, last week I wrote a story about archaeologists working, including some Canadian archaeologists working in Israel, using an AI algorithm, a form of AI called deep learning, to detect little shards and tools in sediment and detect signs that they had been exposed to fire. So in other words, it was early signs of the use of fire by our hominin ancestors a million years ago, in a place where no previous signs of fire had ever been seen before. There's no sign of fire to the archaeologist's eye, but the AI detected it in the sediment. So, and I said to the scientist, so you're basically telling me that you're using our newest technology, or one of our newest technologies, to look for signs of our oldest technology. And they thought, wow, that's a really cool way of looking at it. And I thought, let's see a computer come up with that analogy. But anyway, all right, let's get today's talk. As technology matures, this technology and becomes more pervasive, of course it's important to discuss how it might impact us, how it might impact different sectors of business and life, and what the ethical risks and considerations are that must be taken into account. So we have two panelists today who are the ideal people to speak to this. First we have Mai Mavencurve. She's Vice President of Data at TradeX, which is an import-export company, and is employing AI in that context, but she's also the Chief Tech Advisor for Innovate Cities. That's a not-for-profit that's kind of working in the municipal space around issues that also relate to AI and data sharing. Thank you very much, Mai. We also have Mahima Pushkarna. She's a Senior User Experience Designer for Google's People Plus AI Research Initiative, also based here in Toronto. Mai's based in Mississauga, and she also is right at that interface between technological development and social impact of AI. Thank you very much for joining us. Mahima, please join me in welcoming our panelists today. So that's given you a very quick introduction to who our panelists are, but I'm going to start with a few questions and get them to elaborate a little bit more on their experience. So Mahima and Maynex, we'll start with you, Mahima. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work in Google, and especially, how AI, obviously you were part of that initiative, how AI manifests itself in your work?
Sure. So I am an interaction designer at the People Plus AI Research Initiative here in Google. And our mission is to essentially enable more productive, more beneficial human and AI partnerships. Now, this is a really unique position because I'm an interaction designer, not someone you would expect to actually be deep in a research team in AI. But it's fascinating because it is an opportunity to take these sort of cutting-edge research concepts in AI, whether it's unpacking the black box or identifying ways in which we can bring transparency and explainability to how AI systems make decisions, but actually turning them into products, tools, mostly in the open source world, that teams all across the world can use at a very low cost in ways that we're very considerate of the implications when it comes to society and ethics of this technology. So that's some of the ways in which my work manifests and where I engage with AI.
Got it. And I remembered I have to come over here and join you so I can actually feels like a real conversation. And how about you, Maya? Can you tell us a little about your, especially in the kind of that trade world, how is AI part of that?
Yeah, so currently I'm VP of Data at a company called TradeX, and we are a global company dealing in primarily automotive wholesale import-export. Now you're going to wonder, well, where does AI come in? But what we're building with machine learning is actually a pretty sophisticated trading engine that's going to allow us to identify effectively arbitrage opportunities to be able to know where certain things should go across the globe. In previous AI work, I've worked kind of in a lot of different sectors of AI. We used AI around sensitive topics such as predicting mental health conditions as well, looking at data to kind of help in the public health domain, as well as combining AI with computer vision, where we can look at satellite imagery to determine, okay, how much arable land, as an example, is there in particular parts of the world. So you can see there's kind of a pretty broad application.
Got it.
Yeah.
So as I was telling people earlier, I cover science, and increasingly I'm seeing the use of AI in science basically wherever you have large data sets and potentially access to fast computation. But I'm wondering what the two of you who are really embedded in this technology, what changes your work? Like from where you sit, what are you seeing that's changing, or what are the trends that you think are worth noting? Go ahead, Mahima.
So if you are in the AI space, you'll start to see the rise of what some people call foundation models. These are really large, very powerful models that can do multiple downstream tasks. And it's very interesting because now we're going away from just predicting things to actually generating things, right? Language, audio, and even images. And the nice part about these models is that these are not happening in a random fashion. We have the controls and the levers to manage these models, to manipulate them. So for example, as a designer, I have a model that can generate images, and I can say, I want to see a bear riding a spaceship to the moon while eating a watermelon, but in Monet style, and I can actually get that. So I think there's a lot of there are a lot of interesting applications of these large foundation models, and the thing to look out for is how good we are as humans in deciding how to use these models.
Yeah, and I'll probably pick up on that. I mean, apart from kind of all the incredible things going on sort of in the research and algorithm space, for me, the biggest shift I think I've seen is sort of awareness in the public and sort of the government and businesses that, we need to kind of better understand this technology. And we need to really be very mindful of how we are going to build transparency into that entire pipeline. And so AI is not just about AI, it's also about the data that's powering that AI. And so the governance that's required kind of all the way through, I think that's really the biggest shift I've seen. And I think, we're seeing that with different regulations coming, into the forefront around the world. And so I think that whole awareness around, transparency and sort of that regulatory space has shifted drastically.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there some sort of is there some precedent for that? As these technologies are being introduced, are there earlier examples of the introduction of technologies that have the potential to have that impact, that are lessons for us to draw on, or is this really from creating from scratch how we deal with this change?
So I think for me, the short answer is, the short answer is no. In the sense, yes, there are examples that we can draw from, I believe. I think all technology kind of at this nascent stage is disruptive. Where this is different, let me back up a second. The example I would look at is social media, actually.
Yeah, I was just thinking
that's
about
a
that.
really good example to think about and maybe draw a parallel, not from a technology perspective, but from an impact perspective. What are the lessons we can learn from, hey, it's an amazing technology, but we didn't really think through kind of the full impact of it, but hey, we can still kind of, maybe figure out what those guardrails are. So, again, slightly different very different technology, but could we use lessons learned from that and draw some parallels, in our world of AI? So that's maybe the best one I would say, and it's very recent in most people's minds.
Got it. That actually brings me to something I wanted to ask Mahima. I know you recently conducted a study, and this is where you're proposing a method for how designers can document data transparently when designing AI technology or scaling technology. So first I want to ask you what that means, in the sense of why that's important, and I think it relates to what we've been talking about, but also what was the result of that study? So tell us about it.
So more than designers, in fact. The framework that we proposed is called data cards, but it is essentially it's a documentation framework for transparency, which is a superset. So it's not just technical documentation or technical specifications, but our goal is really to capture all the human decisions that were made across the life cycle of data sets, so that when you choose to use the data set to train an AI model or establish some governance protocols, data governance protocols, there is a clear trail on who was involved, what they said, what decisions were made, what alternatives were considered. Because what we're finding is that as we build AI technologies, the real way to make them responsible AI technologies is to make sure that you're identifying all the stakeholders across data and AI system life cycles. So not just the people who are responsible for the data alone, but people who are responsible for saying, yes, you can use this. So people who may never engage with the data sets themselves possibly will never manipulate it, but have a say, have an agency in this. So you want to bring all these people in a very participatory framework to the same platform, if you will, so they can have a nuanced and deep conversation about how data sets are created and how they're used. And that's really the crux of the study. We did this over 3 years, working with 40 teams, and our focus has been not to treat this as a toy problem, but to actually see what does it mean for a company like Google, where we have hundreds and thousands of data sets. How can we create something that can effectively scale at that size?
And maybe it would be good for the audience too, everyone kind of comes at this from different directions, why data is so integral to the conversation when we're talking about AI. I mean, we think of data, we're told to protect our data, we're told, we talk sometimes about sharing data and who's got access to our data. Why does that come up again and again when we're talking about the potential of AI?
Because AI is only as good as the data that it learns from. If you're, it's going to try to approximate things. I like to think of it as you're teaching, a child to tell the difference between a cat and a dog, and then you put an Egyptian cat in front of, the child, and the child's like, well, I don't know if that's a cat because it doesn't have fur. So it's really just as good as what you're teaching it, and that material to teach AI systems is data.
Got it. And also that means there's great value in data, because the more you have, or the better you can use it, the more effective the AI. So I know, you have also worked as in addition to your 9 to 5, you're often thinking and advising about issues around data governance. And I'm wondering what you're seeing there. First of all, what does that work like, and what are the innovations or approaches that you're seeing emerging in that space?
Sure, and just for a very quick background, the work that I've done is around standards, so standards and data governance with the Standards Council of Canada, as well as working at a think tank called CG, where recently really looking at AI and emerging technologies, which includes obviously AI, data, blockchain, et cetera, but its impact on national security. And when I if I kind of boil it down to, well, what are kind of the big takeaways from that? I think the big realization across the board has been, yes, data has value, but how are we actually building the mechanism such that, okay, we recognize it has value, but what are we doing about it, and how do we do that? So as an example, in addition to kind of the things that Mahima talked about, where, from an enterprise perspective, you've got kind of that data supply chain, and at every single stage, you've got to make sure you've got the proper governance in place before before you actually deliver an AI algorithm. On a national scale, it kind of really gets into issues around, how are we building the innovation ecosystem, right? So in Canada, do we need national data infrastructure? Should we be really recognizing data as a national asset that we need to protect in certain cases, right? Do we need a sovereign cloud infrastructure? There's so many different layers to the conversation that are really starting to be discussed, and it really just all boils down to, I need to protect my data, but I want to use that for good. So how do I balance that out?
I'm reminded of a real world example about this, because again, we're sort of I think the common posture is protect the data, which is great until that really gets in your way. And I was working on a story last year about how Canada was kind of out front with genomic sequencing of the virus that causes COVID-19, and of course mutations in the virus and the emergence of variants that have caused us so much trouble after the initial arrival of the pandemic. And the maddening thing was that there was all this data across the country, a lot of it coming into different provincial health labs, but allowing that data to be shared between provinces, between academic and provincial labs, and between the National Microbiology Lab, all of which were getting instructions and resources to try to do the sequencing so that we could have a picture of the evolving pandemic in Canada and also provide that data in a global context. There were so many barriers, so many hurdles that it was hard for the data to be useful in real time. And you realize, this is a way, that data could have really helped guide decision making during the pandemic, and the tools were there, the technology was there, the knowledge were there, the training was there, but there was no incentive or mechanism where the people who had the data could move it back and forth. And I'm wondering, does that mean there should be standards? It's hard to invent that while you're in the middle of a health crisis. So should there be standards, or should there be some common framework? Because who knows what the next emergency is going to be?
So I'll quickly comment on that.
Yes, please.
There are, in fact, standards that are coming out. There's one, around a zero copy standard, as an example. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could, it's not that we're making copies of data everywhere or sharing data all across, but we're enabling and sharing access and allowing for access. So people are thinking about this exact problem. How can we actually share data across but still maintain control? There's new frameworks around data trust, data collaboratives. I mean, there's a whole pile of work an activity that's happening to solve this exact problem.
Got it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the picture we're seeing here is a technology that's moving quickly, developing quickly. I think, most people now have heard of deep learning. AI is used all the time. Deep learning, other forms of AI, machine learning are sometimes now in the common vernacular, certainly in some of the stories that we write at the Globe. Things like foundational modeling sounds like, boy, another whole new chapter that's going to change everything. And meanwhile, we're trying to create these ethical and social impact considerations. So there's a lot to ask. I have another couple of questions for you both, but I also want to make sure if there's anyone in the audience or also virtually, if there are questions in the virtual space for those who are watching who want to, questions that relate to this interface between this future or this present technology and its future potential and how it will affect us. If there are any questions in the audience. Looks like we've got one back there.
Yeah, we have one from the virtual audience. Someone asked, what are he said, Elon Musk has stated that AI is an existential risk if not controlled. Is this a reasonable worry?
Oh, that's the big question.
Yeah.
You don't have to answer Elon Musk directly, but is it?
No, I don't try that. I think one of the things that we definitely need to think about is our relationship with technology as a society and how technology in turn mediates our own relationships with each other and sort of advances our cultural standing. We use the term artificial intelligence, and you've heard, if you ever hear a researcher talk about machine learning, they'll call those little units neurons. But what we often miss is that the reason we call these neurons is that they're just inspired by neurons in the brain. It's not a literal explanation. And then intelligence, there's a huge debate around what is sentience, what is intelligence, what does it mean to be conscious? And that is a conversation which has many facets, not just technological. So, there's the cognitive aspect of it, there's the physiological aspect of it. So I personally, I think it's a far stretch to say that, it's an existential threat. I think there are plenty of other things for us to consider on a daily basis. We're coming out of a pandemic. So I think that the long story short is that AI is a technology, the way cars are a technology, the way, there are so many other technologies, and it all boils down to what we do with it and how we mediate our own relationships with it.
One thing that's interesting is some of the founders of modern AI as we know it now, and I'm thinking of Yoshua Bengio and others at the University of Montreal a few years ago, came up with the Montreal Declaration for the ethical use of AI. And I think we're seeing that to some extent in the CRISPR gene editing space as well, where the scientists who are sort of developing the technology are recognizing that they have a role to play in kind of creating a conscience about how it's used. I want to ask about that, but we have at least one more question from the audience right there. Let's see if we can.
Yes, thank you. I was fascinated by the data sets, and I'm wondering, how do you gather, or are there obstacles to gathering a representative enough data set for the AI to actually answer the question you want answered that's going to be a valid answer?
So there are many, usually it's rarely one single model that comes into play when you interact with, for example, Google Assistant. It's a complex and connected network of models. And no technology and no data set is neutral in that, it will never be fully representative, simply because, it changed, even geographically, there are lots of unique cultures that need to be addressed. So you want it to be representative, but you also want it to be generalizable enough. So the way to really do that is be very thoughtful and mindful right from the get-go. And we now have a whole set of tools and suites. For example, from my group, we have tools like the What If tool. We have a tool called Know Your Data, which, its primary task is to identify skews and balances in your data set. So just by being very mindful and rigorously analyzing and conducting what we call intersectional analyses of data sets, that's like one step closer to more representative data sets. But thinking about it also in terms of, I'm collecting this data set, what are the downstream implications when they're used in product spaces? Because it's a compounding effect of decisions that actually decides if or not an AI system will give you a valid response.
I know we've got another question right over there. We can get one from that side of the room.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, hi. Data is the new oil, and data governance and data strategy assume very important roles. How can Canada leverage data for propelling economic prosperity and growth? One part. And the second thing is, now data security and data privacy has become very important. So many governments around the world, including Canada, European Union, they are pushing back against the tech giants because for them, data is the major source of their profitability, and there's a pushback against them. So how does Google and other companies are addressing those issues?
So I think that might be a question for you, for Google.
Taking a minute to unpack
I can
that.
give the other answer, but.
Yeah, do you want to lead, and then I can hop in with the...
Yeah, I mean, I think it touches on what I said previously, which is, yes, we have an opportunity. There's regulations coming around data protection. That's the first thing. I mean, we have to recognize that our data is important as Canadians. We have to recognize that it does have economic value. But if we're not able to have the underlying infrastructure to share that data, to collaborate with that data, then really it's kind of all for naught. So I always focus kind of on the data infrastructure piece, unless, I mean, the strategy is critical and important, and that is what is being worked on. But when you want to operationalize that, you need to make sure we have that data infrastructure in place. And that to me is like the missing gap right now that we don't have within our country. And I think that's the part that we need to work on, both from an economic prosperity perspective, but also a national security perspective. So yeah, that's my kind of short answer on it. But.
Some countries like UK, Singapore, Estonia, they are doing a lot of big leverage data for economic growth.
Yeah.
That is a big opportunity.
But that's a huge, that's exactly, yeah, I mean,
Exactly.
that's what Canada needs to be doing. So.
And we are following the EU GDPR, essentially.
Well, I mean, we just actually, there was Bill, you can look at Bill C, I'll keep it short, Bill C-27, I think it just came out last week, where we're kind of moving towards that kind of, arena of, okay, protecting citizens and giving more rights to citizens. So, we'll see how it all pans out. Yeah.
I think, at least on the Google side, there's a lot of work being done. Like we have entire organizations called Trust and Safety and Privacy, and we're doing a lot of active work to ensure that not only are the way we handle data that's done very responsibly, but also the way we use data is extremely is done with a lot of consideration and care for what happens in the downstream world. It's precisely that sort of thinking that allows a team like my own, which is a combination of social scientists, so people who are, we're not all computer scientists in there. We are people over there who are very actively championing and thinking about what does it mean for people on the ground, small business owners, individuals, how they negotiate their lives with data, and how it is that we can ensure that at every step of the way, we are making sure that this data is used in service of people who opt into it. So if you sort of look under the hood, there's a why this ad feature. That's an incredible example that really allows you to control your own data. And you've also probably seen all the digital well-being work and so many other efforts, which are all sort of, approaching the data privacy piece, the data trust piece, the transparency piece from different facets. Because it's not a single experience. It's not simple. It's very complex. There are so many relationships and trade-offs that need to be made. So it has to be a multifaceted approach. And behind the scenes, we're seeing a lot of very hardworking people put their heads in there and really tackle on these ambiguous problems and these very nebulous issues.
Google has developing the technology for the facial recognition, which reads emotions, right?
I believe so. I can't speak to it precisely. I'm not in that space.
Is that because of the data privacy issues?
I can't speak to that because I'm not in that space. As I said, like my work is more focused on the open source world and building tools and technologies, less so to do with the service model. So my work is more upstream analysis focused.
But thank you very much for the question and the other questions. Of course, the time is narrow, and I've got to move along to the next panel. I just want to finish off with one quick question for each of our panelists. You know, what is striking about this, even with the social media example that Mia used earlier, how fast things are moving, and you know, it's only a little more than 10 years now that we've had iPhones, that we've had, you know, Facebook and Twitter kind of as part of our daily life, many of us. So if we kind of look 10, 12 years into the future, which seems like that's going to happen in the blink of an eye, and we imagine what that may be like in that short step forward, what do you see as the pathway to ensure that when AI is that much more integrated into our lives, that we're thinking, boy, we did that right, or you know, this was the pathway to keeping the human element at the forefront of decisions. You know, what do you see as the best path forward? And we'll start with Mia.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll keep it short in the sense that I think it's honestly a lot of hard work ahead. To be like, I don't mean to make it sound scary or terrible. I think we all have a very bright future, but I think every single individual has to participate. It's kind of like a democracy, you know. You need to participate in how AI is being built. You need to speak up around and really just get more educated around it. Participation, I think that's the number one kind of takeaway I would say for everybody, if we really want to kind of see that 10-year bright future where technology is doing exactly what we want. Otherwise, you know, it won't be like that.
Yeah, I completely agree. Personally, I think that the only way to really know the future is to design it. But that just means that every one of us is going to have to participate. We're going to have to educate ourselves about how these systems work, and we're going to have to be very reflective of how our experiences are with them. But mostly, I think it doesn't matter where we are on the flagpole. We all need to be engaging in really hard conversations around what are the risks, limitations, opportunities, and benefits of these technologies, and are we doing the right thing about it? So whether you're a computer scientist or somebody who is a small business owner using an AI technology, we all need to be a part of this conversation.
That's a great place to end, and lots of good ideas for stories that we'll want to cover about this in the future for sure. So Mahima Pushkarna and Maima Avankar, thank you very much for your contributions today, for a great conversation. Please join me in thanking our panel. And that's great. What a great day. And now I'm going to turn over the podium to Kelly Kreiderman, my colleague, to bring about our next conversation. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi there, everybody. I'm Kelly Kreiderman. I'm a reporter and columnist based in Calgary for the Globe and Mail, and I'm here to moderate the panel discussion on the future of energy. And I was thinking about, we talk about designing the future, we need to design an energy future for ourselves as well. And of course, as climate change concerns continue to mount, we know that Canada's energy sector will need to be transformed. It'll need to reduce its emissions and capture emissions and conserve vital resources. There are so many opportunities to develop clean energy, particularly in Indigenous communities, and at the same time, the world is grappling with energy security issues and a mismatch right now between supply and demand. We have a great group to address this topic. First of all, we have Wendy Franks, Executive Vice President of Strategy and Investment Management with Northland Power. And joining us virtually is Kevin Krausert, Chief Executive and Co-founder of Avatar Innovations in Calgary. And Charlene Gale, Chief of Fort Nelson First Nation in British Columbia. Charlene is also Chair of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. And last but not least, we have Martha Hall Finley, Chief Climate Officer with Suncor. Is she here virtually as well? Got it. I was thinking she was going to be here in person. Kevin, let's start with you. You spent a great deal of your career in Canada's oil and gas industry. Of course, I've written about beaver drilling. You now run an energy innovation and investment firm. How big is the opportunity related to clean energy?
I think it's probably one of the biggest opportunities in front of Canada and the planet. To reach a net zero future by 2050 is going to require technology, collaboration, and investment on a scale we've frankly never seen before. Some of the preliminary reports, RBC has tagged the investment price to reach a net zero 2050 in Canada at $2 trillion. The International Energy Agency is saying globally it's $4 trillion a year. McKinsey recently came out and put a report out saying it was $9 trillion a year. For a total of $180 trillion. To put $180 trillion in perspective, that is 20% of all government spending and 30% of all private sector profit before 2050. So this is an absolutely staggering endeavor that is in front of us. And I often akin it to the Apollo project of our time. And so the reality is the energy transition is not just wind and solar. Wind and solar are phenomenal industries that need to scale, need to expand, but it's also going to require every possible solution we have. And that's going to require carbon capture, hydrogen, biofuels. We need all solutions at the table for us to be able to do this in any sense of economics. As you know, I think people are already feeling the price of inflation going up. This is going to drive the price of energy up. There's no way around this. But if we tackle this, I think that this is possibly an area Canada can shine. We have some of the leading energy companies in Canada, both in hydro, solar, wind, but also in oil and gas, who are leading the charge on bringing some of this new technology to market. And I think this is the biggest opportunity of our generation.
And Wendy, would you say we're at the early stages of clean energy development in Canada? And what is the size of the opportunity as you see it?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. First of all, just thank you to the Globe and Mail for hosting this event. It's terrific to be here and to be here with my fellow panelists. I'm going to say just a few words about Northland Power because I think it's good context. So we are a Canadian-based company. We've been active in the energy transition. We're about 34 years old. We built some of the first privately owned gas power plants. So we develop, construct, and own power plants which produce electricity that we sell to corporates and governments. We've always been at the forefront of the energy transition. So we built, as I said, some of the first gas plants to replace coal. Then we got into onshore wind and offshore wind. We're based here in Toronto. We're publicly traded. We generate about $2 billion of revenue, but we're really global. We have 3 large offshore wind projects in Europe. And offshore wind is one of the largest, one of the fastest growing technologies globally in decarbonization. So that's a little bit about Northland Power. Where are we in the energy transition? I'd say we're a little bit, beyond the inning stages, but I would agree that I see with Kevin that I see tremendous opportunity, and that's actually in the area of energy export. So on the east and west coasts of Canada, we have a tremendous onshore and offshore wind resource that's never been harnessed. It's never been harnessed because there isn't enough of a load. There isn't enough demand in those areas to justify the big build out of those projects. So while we would have loved to have built some offshore wind projects in Canada, we never have. Now, when you convert that electron into a molecule, that can be stored and transported to Europe, now you have an energy export industry where you can harness that renewable resource. And there is a tremendous demand for hydrogen in Europe. Now, Europe is complicated. Hydrogen is also complicated. But one thing that people may not realize is actually Canadian electrolyzer technology has dominated the global electrolyzer technology space for 3 generations. So Canadian electrolyzer technology, which is the equipment that you need to create the hydrogen, has actually been exported to over 100 countries globally. I think that's really impressive. It comes from the Stewart family, and I checked these stats with Andy Stewart last night. But what is needed to actually harness this amazing resource that we have in Canada, we need the government to introduce a constructive and efficient regulatory framework. Efficient meaning fast moving. We need to move to capitalize on this opportunity that could create a huge amount of economic growth in areas where we haven't traditionally had that.
Okay. And Martha, you are Chief Climate Officer for Suncor, and when we were talking earlier, we were talking about emissions from the oil and gas industry, which account for about 1/4 of Canada's total emissions. And the Globe had a story last week talking about those emission reduction goals, and how there is a document circulating within the federal government that talks about them not being really achievable. What's your view on Canada's climate targets and emission reduction goals?
Well, I have some strong ones, as you can imagine, but I echo Wendy's thanks to the Globe for doing this. This is so important for the country to have this series of conversations, and it's great to be a part of them. First, just Suncor, very briefly, is Canada's largest integrated energy company. We produce a lot of oil, we upgrade, we refine, we own the entire Petro-Canada distribution network. We have refining capacity here in Canada and the US. We do offshore Canada, but also UK and Norway. We are Canada's largest single producer of hydrogen. We are Canada's largest single consumer of hydrogen. So we know hydrogen, Wendy is correct when she says hydrogen is complicated. There's an awful lot of hype out there, but we're very pumped about the prospects. We just announced a big new clean hydrogen project in Edmonton with ATCO, as a joint venture with ATCO, that we will be building. That will be clean hydrogen thanks to CCUS, not electrolysis. They're different techniques. But we certainly see an opportunity for us, and certainly Canada, in that space. We're very big on fuels, and this is, I think, where Canada can play a significant role, because it's very hard to export electricity unless you do conversions, the way Wendy had said, and that can get complicated. And we can't even export natural gas unless we liquefy it, and that's a challenge in this country. We have only one of what were potentially 20 projects on the books that's actually going to get built. That, by the way, is incredibly important for Europe right now, and we can't help them. But we are invested in Enerchem, which is recyclable, non-recyclable municipal waste going into fuel, LanzaTech, LanzaJet for sustainable aviation fuel. So we listen, there's going to be global demand for oil and gas for a long time to come. The most conservative projections are that there's still at least 25 million barrels a day by 2050. Those are the most conservative projections. And Canada only produces 4.5 to 5 million barrels of those. And the oil sands of the oil and gas industry, yes, 25% of Canada's emissions, but the oil and gas, or the oil sands represent 10% of that. And so, Kelly, as you know, the oil sands Pathways to Net Zero Alliance was Suncor's a founder of that. 95% of the oil sands production, and we've made very clear these are the targets for 2030, these are the targets for 2040, these are 20 targets for net zero for 2050. All sorts of technologies, hydrogen for sure, a big part of that, energy efficiency, clearly, fuel switching, solvents. CCUS is going to be our big foundational project, but certainly not the only part of it. But your question was about, and that's context, that's really important. Your question was about the government's emissions reduction plan. I have to stress, those were not targets. The government didn't say they were targets. The government came out with numbers that a number of different organizations had provided, and they made some calls on what those might sound appropriate. They're definitely far more aggressive than what we have said we can do by 2030. But the government also made it very clear it's a consultation period now. They put the numbers out and we're engaged in consultation. And partly because of the much more collaborative role, much more collaborative environment we have now with the federal government in terms of this pathways to net zero. We're actually on the same, we have the same goal, believe it or not, the oil sands in Canada. But that's a huge step change. And so when we now engage in those consultations on 2030, we have a lot more credibility and there's a lot more trust in our ability to say, look, we all want net zero by 2050, but we can't build things that fast in this country. To Wendy's point, we have a regulatory environment that makes things, just basic infrastructure, take a decade or more. So it's 22 and a half right now. We're 7.5 years from 2030. We can't build anything that fast, not of the scale that we need for those reductions. So you know what? Let's talk about 2035. Let's talk about what we can do as quickly as we can do them. And our message to the government is just, and the Globe did great work last week. The message is be really careful, because if you do, after these consultations, set targets that we can't meet, then the government can't meet them either. And if the government doesn't meet their targets again, then ironically we could destroy trust. And we could, as I said, ironically jeopardize all of the incredible efforts we're engaging in to get to net zero by 2050, and we don't want that to happen. So I just, there's still too much of this polarization. They said this, they said this. I really want your audience to know the federal government has stepped up big time in the last couple of years to engage with those of us who are big emitters to say, okay, how can we collaborate? We know there's a challenge. What can we do together to get this done? So there's a lot more collaboration going on than I think people think, and I'm hanging on to that, because without it, we're not going to get very far.
Okay, and Charlene, I've been on a big pivot. I've been keeping up with the energy news in Treaty 8 territory. And of course, Indigenous communities are huge energy asset holders. And I was wondering if you could tell us about a couple of projects that the Fort Nelson First Nation is working on right now.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity. Just to let most of you know that I'm the chair of the First Nation Major Projects Coalition, which started as an initiative of 11 nations working together to have equity positions in major projects that were happening in their territories. And it really gave us the opportunity to look what we could do in Fort Nelson. And so we're working on a geothermal project, which is 100% Indigenous owned by our nation. We're very proud of the project. We were successful in getting a $40 million grant from NRCan. And so next, in a couple weeks here, in the first week of July, we'll have our third test well coming. And so we're inviting people from all around. The Treaty 8 chiefs will be in attendance, a couple ministers from the federal government. But we're really proud of this project because it's repurposing an old oil and gas well. And that oil and gas well was the Clark Lake field, which provided a generational opportunity to many of the people in our community, including myself, that, some are elders now. And so this geothermal project will generate 7 to 14 megawatts of power, which will be able to, provide power to the municipality, to our nation, sell power to the province and to Alberta and to the industrial grid across the street. But also, we know that inflation is rising. The cost of food, the cost of gas is rising for all Canadians across this country. It gives us a little bit more hope and inspiration to really work hard on this project, because food security is going to be a very huge challenge. And we already know that's a huge challenge in the north. So we're looking at developing 100 greenhouses with the heat rights. And there's a lot of spin-off opportunities. With our third test well, we'll be looking at the brine and seeing what opportunities come out of there. I know that, there's a high chance that there could be lithium. And, these critical minerals are going to be something that is very, very important as we start looking at net zero by 2050. Yeah, so with the geothermal project in Fort Nelson, we've did a lot of community engagement with our community members and been working with people that have been involved in geothermal for the past 30 years in New Zealand. They came to my community in April, so we're learning about best practices, learning about where do you get this infrastructure, what is the best practice to move forward. So as a community, I have to say that we welcome you. This is something new. It's a new technology, and we're excited to share with the world about what we learn.
Great. And you know, Kevin, you touched on the costs of the energy transition. And when you're talking about how that will be financed, what do you point to? Where will that money come from?
It's going to come from the markets, right? Institutional equities are going to be a primary driver for it. Private equity, retail investors, and venture capital. You know, it's going to come from the investment pools. And I think that there's a lot of institutional investment dollars that are available for great projects. You know, Charlene is mentioning, I think, a really phenomenal example of what a great energy transition project could look like. You know, you're leveraging some historical oil and gas assets, you're thinking about them in a new way, you're re-empowering a community, not just on energy development, but also on food security. You know, that's the model I think that it's going to be looking for. But also, realistically, there's public dollars in that as well too. So on the big infrastructure plays, I think it's going to be a combination of the institutional investors as well as public dollars in smart ways. The Fed's just announced a $9 billion fund to be investing in these types of projects. I hope it doesn't get too political, but we'll see. But where I think that Canada has an opportunity as well as a little bit of a gap is on early stage commercial investments. You know, if you take the International Energy Agency's assumption, and I realize not everybody does, that 50% of technologies that are required for a net zero future don't yet exist or are pre-commercial. I think we can all agree at least it's some high number or significant number. The way emerging technologies end up getting to market is a lot of risk capital being placed on a bunch of small risky bets to see which one can kind of make it to market. And that's where Canada has a big gap in comparison to the United States. Many of the early stage venture capital funds are now, smallest check size they're writing is a $10 million check on a $50 million deal. Now, I'm old enough to remember when that was private equity, but I think that the Americans are starting to eat our lunch on some of these early stage technologies that we need to address as a country, because who knows which pathway is going to be the true pathway to net zero. So we need to have our bets on a whole bunch of options for us to turn this into a real opportunity. Canada is blessed with tremendous amounts of grants, but we need more risk capital if we're gonna win this race. Because there's too much capital for big deals that aren't ready to be built yet, and as Martha said, they might take a decade to build.
Come from?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, agree with everything that Kevin just said. Just as one example, Northland Power, we raised $1 billion in an overnight book build in the public markets about a year ago. So we went to market at 5 o'clock one afternoon, and we closed out that raise. It was $900 million. We upsized it by another 10% by the next morning, about 9 a.m. the next morning. And that's for a Canadian publicly traded company. I'm not even talking about a New York or LSE listed company. So the capital markets have really never been so receptive to funding these types of clean energy infrastructure companies. And part of the reason for that is actually I used to be an investor at the Canada Pension Plan. And so part of the reason for that is that there's been a huge amount of capital that's actually flown into private infrastructure. Why is that? It's because interest rates were low. So if you were operating a pension fund, normally you would put your assets into fixed income securities, but interest rates were so low, so you need to go a little bit out on the risk spectrum to get a higher return so that you could fulfill your liability obligations. So where did you go? You went to long-term, steady, reliable, contracted cash flow for infrastructure assets. And so as a result, there's just been billions, tens and hundreds of billions of dollars that have been allocated to private infrastructure, which is just really fantastic. So, in a way, there's never been such a big opportunity in the energy transition. I think Kevin summarized some of the numbers well. And while it is a staggering amount of capital that needs to be raised to do this, I think it's entirely possible.
Mm-hmm. And Martha, I wanted to ask you about, and I always stumble on this name, the Pathways to Net Zero Alliance, because we know there's a lot of groups focused on this right now, but this is the main one for oil sands producers. Correct me if I'm wrong now, because I know there was some movement last week on that. But what is the argument for public and private dollars going towards the net zero goal in the oil sands?
So I'm not sure what movement. The Pathways, as you said, Suncor is one of the founders. It now represents the 6 main companies, 95% of the oil sands production. So basically oil sands. And as a reminder, we do represent 10% of Canada's emissions. So we're a big part of the challenge. We recognize we need to be a big part of the solution. One of our big projects is to be able to get to net zero is carbon capture and storage. And it's interesting, there are 2 big projects in Europe, the Longship Northern Lights project in Norway, covering a fair bit of Northern Europe, and the Porthos project in Holland. Oddly enough, the Alberta and Saskatchewan and underneath the seabed in the North Sea share among the best geology for carbon sequestration in the world. So it's not by accident that these are happening. Our Pathways foundational project will be to date the largest CCUS project in the world. The reason it can't be funded and Longship Northern Lights, very significant Norwegian government engagement. Porthos, the same thing, very significant Dutch engagement. UK projects, the same. United States are at least 10 CCUS projects, but they wouldn't be happening if it weren't for the 45Q tax regime opportunity in the United States. So in the most recent federal budget, the federal government announced an investment tax credit to help carbon capture and storage. And the reason that's important, whether it's Norway or Holland or the UK or the US or now Canada, is that you earn revenue by taking stuff out of the ground and selling it on the global market. You don't necessarily earn revenue by taking stuff and putting it back in the ground. It just stays there. And there are carbon credits. There are offsets in terms of carbon taxes that you don't pay. So there are benefits to that. But right now, the idea of generating revenue from CCUS is very, very challenging, especially in Canada, because the tax credit won't apply to enhanced oil recovery, which it does in the United States. So if you don't have revenue, it's really hard for a public company to justify spending the capital. And in Canada, the oil and gas industry is global. It's a global industry. We're global competitors. Suncor absolutely competes globally, but we don't compete on price. We compete on investors. And so if our bottom line is significantly more challenged than our international competitors, including, by the way, a lot that are not particularly high on the ESG scale, then investors will go elsewhere. You know, we talk about sustainable finance and we talk about investing in infrastructure, but fundamentally it's not philanthropic. Investment needs a return, and it will look for the returns that are competitive. And so there's no question the Norwegians, the Dutch, the Canadians, the Americans, and now the Canadians have recognized this kind of collaboration is absolutely critical. It's a co-investment. Listen, we're going to be spending billions of dollars into this, but that won't be enough. And so we absolutely see this as a co-investment that is critical for all of us to be engaged in order to be able to realize significant emission reductions.
Kelly, I want to build on that point because I think Martha's making a really important point around the resource that we have for the future here. You know, I've never worked at an oil sands company, but having watched, you know, the energy industry closely, as the oil sands was built, there was this assumption that it was sort of high carbon and high cost. You know, the initial lift costs were like $60 a barrel inside the oil sands. Now you see oil sands production at like single digits on their lift costs. And over the space of a decade, they brought this technological horsepower. So in a 2050 scenario where you're burning 25 million barrels a day, a $8 lift cost competes against the Saudis. We can be the last barrel out of the ground if we invest in making it sure it's also the lowest carbon technologies. So what the sort of technological and engineering genius the oil sands brought to their cost profile, we can also bring to the cost profile of carbon capture and change the cost curve. Because, you know, right now most carbon projects are sort of $70 a ton to make them economic. There's all of these emerging technologies that are sort of being de-risked, that are point source carbon capture technologies that fundamentally change the cost curve of carbon capture that Canada can win. And the oil sands pathways can be this incredible sandbox for Canada commercialized carbon capture technologies we can export to the world. So I see this as an investment in the future of Canada as the most responsible producer of oil in the world.
Well, and if we could listen, we have the Americans asking us to produce more. They went to Venezuela first, then the Iranians, but you know, luckily they are actually asking us now. Geopolitics are fascinating. But the challenge that Canada has now is that we have basically turned down projects for market egress, whether it was Northern Gateway or Keystone, meant that we didn't put the capital into increasing production because we had nowhere to go. If we can get our heads around this, I mean, we're top of the chart on ESG on every other metric other than the elephant in the room, which is emissions. Even those have been coming down dramatically, but we have to get them to zero and to net zero. And so we get Canadian oil and gas production to net zero. We absolutely should be the globally preferred source from an energy security perspective, from a climate perspective. But frankly, we're going to have to get Canadians to say, yeah, that actually makes sense. We should be producing more so that we can actually take market share away from the Russians and the Saudis. I mean, listen, I just think this is a huge opportunity for Canada for all the right reasons.
I want to go back to that energy security issue later, but I do want to ask Charlene too, what tools, and again, we're switching, but we'll go back. What tools do First Nations and Indigenous communities need from a financial perspective so that there are more projects like the ones you're talking about and will lead to energy independence and income for a lot of these communities?
Well, I think we need to change the narrative in Canada, especially with the big corporations and incorporating the I in ESG. The Indigenous component is going to be very important because to access these critical minerals and natural resources, you're going to have to access Indigenous lands. And they need to be involved. And I think that, you know, as First Nation people, we want to be involved in a meaningful way going forward. You know, what I find if we are is that you'll see more Indigenous businesses benefiting. You'll see a lot of regulatory and restrictions lifted because, you know, if we're equity partners and co-partners, it's the truest form of consent. One of the biggest challenges that we're having is the access to capital. And that's huge because, you know, as Kevin said, we do need more risk capital financing out there for us to be able to build these projects. And historically, over time, we've been stripped of our wealth. And I think we need to find new financing ways to help Indigenous people be involved in this. You know, altogether with our membership, we have a combined capital cost of $17 billion of renewable projects that want to be built in this country. And to be able to have growth and recovery, Indigenous people need to be involved meaningfully. And so through the work of the coalition, what we have been doing is getting our communities ready so that they can make informed business decisions, so that they can work with corporate Canada to be successful and to understand what these deals mean and to bring it back to their members. So, you know, there's consent there too. And you know, there's a lot of work to do, and I'm proud of the work that the coalition has done in the past 5 years. You know, we just had a very successful conference about getting to net zero by 2050. The dialogue was very engaged, and we had people from all over the world talking about this issue. But in order for us to be successful going forward, we need to have Indigenous inclusion, and we need to get over this, you know, access to capital for Indigenous communities. And one of the things that I see that Ontario and Alberta are doing is the loan guarantee program. And I hope that, you know, with the announcement of the Minister Wilkinson, is that we'll be able to roll that out nationally with his announcement. So yeah, the access to capital is a huge issue for Indigenous communities.
And I know I want to be mindful of the time, but I do want to ask you all, starting with you, Wendy, about how things have changed this year with an increased focus on energy security, inflation, costs, whether that has affected your outlook, your plans, or not, right? Has it changed things for you?
I mean, it hasn't changed our thesis around allocating capital to renewable power assets. It's been a very complicated time, right? Inflation has driven up our CapEx costs. And interest rates are higher. But what's been really interesting is what you mentioned before, and the panelists have mentioned, is around energy independence in Europe. It's really creating, I think, an unprecedented opportunity in Canada. And just a couple of stats. So going back to the example of what we could do in the Maritimes, it is a world-class offshore wind resource in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. In Nova Scotia, you could produce about 1 million metric tons of hydrogen per year. The global demand for hydrogen right now is 90 million tons. We could produce 1 in Nova Scotia. We could probably do half, maybe a little bit more, 500,000 metric tons per year in Newfoundland. Similar numbers on the west coast of Canada. Right now in Nova Scotia, there is no regulatory framework for us to do the environmental studies that we need to do to characterize the wind resource to get moving with this. So the government is moving in the right direction. Similarly, in Newfoundland, there's actually currently a moratorium on onshore wind in the province of Newfoundland. The Premier has said that that is to be lifted. But again, this could be something that could, you know, the wind resource there is upwards of 5 to 10 gigawatts. That would translate into $20 to $30 billion of investment into that economy and countless jobs, and these are high quality jobs. And a lot of this is being driven by the fact that, as I said, you can do wind to hydrogen, you can export that molecule then to Europe, and Europe is very interested, as we all know, in diversifying their energy supply. And actually, I brought a quote. So Trudeau met with Chancellor Olaf Scholz earlier this year in March, and coming out of that meeting, the Chancellor said, "It is important for us to initiate close cooperation on this issue, renewable energies. That is what we have set out to do together. Hydrogen from Canada plays a central role in economic cooperation between the two countries." What an amazing statement and testament of support to generate a Canadian energy export economy.
And you know, we're from government officials in Canada, we're hearing a lot more talk about walking and chewing gum at the same time. And that is referring to balancing energy security and climate. And I just want to ask you all, Charlene, Martha, and Kevin, how has the change in outlook and a greater focus on energy security and energy independence, how has that changed your world or your plans this year? Charlene, you can go first if you want.
Thank you. I think that, you know, First Nations are leading this energy transition in a way where a lot of these projects on a smaller scale are in our communities, whether it's, you know, windmills, geothermal, biomass, you know, we're leading this transition, and we want to be a part of this transition, because if we are, it alleviates a lot of the poverty that's been happening in our communities. And I think that there's a real opportunity for First Nations, industry, and government to work constructively together to make sure that we reach our goals. And that's the only way I see it being possible as we try to, position ourselves strategically, to be the leader in this than other countries. But I think the best way to do that is to really start building the relationships with the First Nation communities. This is a big global issue and a big global challenge. And, with the inflation, we want to have affordable, clean energy for everyone. And First Nations communities can no longer be tucked away on reserve while your communities grow around us. We need to be at the forefront, and we need to ensure that we are included in moving that needle on energy transition, on reconciliation, and on inclusion. And I think the more that we do this together, the farther we'll go.
Martha?
Kelly, I would say it's interesting how many people have suggested, both here in Canada and elsewhere, that with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, somehow climate gets put into the back seat. And I cannot stress enough that for Suncor and for the companies in Pathways, absolutely not. We've had people ask, we've had investors ask, so are you going to, put the brakes on your net zero efforts? Absolutely not. We do not feel that this is an and, or this is an or. It has to be an and. So that's something that we feel really, really strongly. So as we're sitting around making significant CapEx decisions, not one of those decisions has changed. We have not revisited any single one of them. So I think that's really important to stress. What I will say, however, is that the discussion is changing, and it should change, because we've had too many Canadians think of Canada as this island. One, emissions don't carry passports, but frankly, nor does energy, or it carries passports only when you have infrastructure that is holding it back. And for us now, we've had too many people say, because of emissions in Canada, we need to stop production. I mean, we've had people thankfully not now, but in the past, senior people from the government saying, shut it all down, just keep it in the ground. And Kelly, you would know just what that does for national unity, right? So that's not going to work. The opposite, I think, is an opportunity. As we talked before, you can recognize if Canada's top of the charts on ESG, we get our emissions down to net zero, we should be displacing Russian oil and gas. We should be displacing Saudi oil and gas. Listen, I'm really proud to be Canadian, and for a lot of reasons. And if we have that opportunity, then we should be able to say, so why shouldn't we actually be producing more? And we're still caught, and the Americans are asking us to produce more, as I said before now. The Europeans are asking us to produce more. We have European politicians behind closed doors, and frankly, right now, G7 meetings, we're being chastised because Canada is just simply not stepping up. So, we should be, and for a number of reasons, and we should do it proudly. And I just think it just means we have to get beyond this Canada as an island, shut it down or stop production, because that's our contribution to emissions reduction. I think that's really I get where it's coming from, but it's not how we see Canada and its role in the world.
Kevin, any last thoughts there?
Yeah, I think there's been almost a maturity and a realization that's come in the last 6-12 months around energy and the role Canada can play in it. First and foremost, rewind 2 years ago, the amount of investment going into pre-revenue clean tech companies was just absolutely absurd, driving valuations up to unsustainable valuations at like 50 or 75 times cash flow. Everyone was saying oil was dead. You fast forward, 2 years later, and now you're seeing the tech and the clean tech stock indexes drop by 50 to 60%, and a realization that this transition is going to take decades. And then you've also got the oil and gas industry as, being a responsible provider around and reliable provider around the world in a much different cash flow position. And so I think what's happened is it puts the oil and gas industry in the driver's seat of the energy transition. These are going to be highly profitable companies for the foreseeable future, and I think they're starting to get some airtime or the light of day on the incredible work that's happening in emissions reduction across the oil and gas sector. I can't have a meeting in oil and gas where we're not talking about emissions reduction. Like, we are working really, really busily on this. And so I think there's almost an awakening realization that we have to do this together. Perhaps that's the most Canadian of stories of, how do we do this together? This is not one form of energy is good, another form of energy is bad. This is how do we reduce emissions? And I think from public policymakers' perception is, now that we're in sort of this new era of energy security and energy transition, how do you incentivize these highly profitable energy companies to invest in the early stage technologies that reduces emissions? That needs to be the conversation, because if their investors are just telling them, give us our money back as quickly as possible, we need to think about smart and creative ways as a country to incentivize the technology of the future using this incredible resource that we have.
Do we have time for any questions, or do we have one question from the floor? Yeah.
I've heard a lot of things said, but I just want to talk about clean energy for Canada. The future of clean energy for Canada is nuclear power and hydroelectric power. These are heavy-duty powers that can power all our cities and power Canada into the future. The other power, solar power, wind power, and wave power, water power, those can only power small villages. But there's one problem with nuclear power. Nuclear power produces nuclear waste, and at the moment we are dumping it in the sea. Now this nuclear waste has to be removed from the sea and recycled because it is radioactive. Now since nuclear waste is radioactive, it can be recycled. Now how do we recycle it? That takes advanced chemistry, advanced chemical engineering, and advanced nuclear engineering, all working together to recycle nuclear waste and put it back in a nuclear reactor. And once we do this, we can build nuclear-powered ships, nuclear-powered trains, nuclear-powered passenger aircraft, and nuclear-powered military aircraft. And then we head into the space program with nuclear-powered spaceships. That's where we're headed.
We need a whole session on that.
Yeah, we need
obviously.
a whole session on that. Yeah.
So,
thank you anyway.
Any more? Or no time? No time. Thank you so much. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Charlene. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Kevin, for all your insights. It's really interesting. We're going to be talking about energy a lot the next couple of years for sure.
Oh yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
So welcome back, and I hope you enjoyed the break. I'm Catherine Blaze-Baum. I'm the Globe and Mail's environment reporter, and I'm pleased to be here to moderate a panel discussion on climate change leadership. So last summer, I reported on the heat dome in BC, the wildfires, flooding, and there's just, I just did a piece last weekend or the weekend before about extreme heat, which is apt on a day like today. And there's a growing consensus that Canada is simply not moving fast enough to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So we have a great group of panelists that are here to share ideas and solutions on that front. So I'd like to begin by introducing them. First, we have Jesse McCormick, and he is the Director of Research, Innovation, and Legal Affairs with the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. Jesse is also a lawyer and former federal staffer who was the Director of Policy under former federal Environment and Climate Change Minister Catherine McKenna, if I have that right. Okay. Next, we have James Skongak, and he is the Chief Development Officer and Executive Vice President of Operational Services with Bruce Power. Also joining us is James Larson, CEO of an energy storage company called eZinc. So we have two Jameses and a Jesse here right now. And then joining us virtually, we have Kahakasha Basu, and she is a United Nations human rights champion and founder president of the Green Hope Foundation. And she is joining us. When I spoke with her last, she was in Bonn, but where are you joining us from?
I'm in Denver, Colorado.
Oh, in Colorado. Okay, well, I think we are all set to begin then. Okay, so Jesse, we will start with you. So there's a recognition in Canada that we can learn a lot from Indigenous experience and Indigenous practices as it relates to climate change. So starting super high level, what are your thoughts on the role of Indigenous people and communities in that work?
I think Indigenous peoples are going to play a critical role in transitioning to a net zero economy, but also providing intellectual capital in fighting climate change. Indigenous communities are some of the first communities to be impacted by climate change. Myself, I'm from a First Nation called Chippewas of the Thames, not too far from here. We're seeing impacts. You're seeing them across the north. You're seeing them in many places. And you're seeing impacts on ways of life that are informed by millennia of experience working with the land. And I think what we're going to see, hopefully what we're going to see, is improved opportunities for Indigenous peoples to influence decision making. And in doing so, by bringing Indigenous people into the spaces where decisions are being made, creating opportunities for some of the values, some of the concepts, some of the spirituality and life systems that are guiding the decision making of Indigenous peoples to also help have a place in the boardrooms of corporate Canada.
And so first of all, can everybody hear us okay, or is that, the mics are okay? No? It's maybe a little bit louder. Very practically speaking, how are Indigenous people affected we often hear that Indigenous communities are on the front lines of climate change. I think it might be helpful for everyone if we can sort of lay that out a little bit.
Certainly. It depends on where you are. It depends on the Indigenous community specifically. But if you're a salmon fishing community, you're watching the salmon pool around the heads of the rivers because they're not going upstream because of the temperatures. If you're Inuit up in Tuktoyaktuk, you might be watching erosion as your house is starting to lean into the sea because the ice is further out and the wave action is causing erosion at an accelerated rate. You're seeing species relied upon by Indigenous peoples less available and harder to harvest because of impacts on migration patterns or increased disease because of increased temperatures. But also you're seeing at the community level an impact associated with the displacement of resources that could otherwise be applied to schools, cultural strengthening, or other endeavors are being redirected to adaptation in relation to climate change. So taking money that could go into helping kids get better nutrition is something that may need to be thinking about how that money might go into forest fires or evacuation plans or other measures related to adaptation. So there's a lot of ways that climate change is impacting Indigenous peoples in Canada.
Right, I guess resources are finite, so they have to be kind of redistributed.
Government programming tends to put a focus on specific utilization of funds. But you're still seeing communities that just have to allocate human capital, the resources they can direct to different subjects, and ultimately the impacts that are impacting the rest of Canada, infrastructure, travel time, are all in many ways exacerbated in communities that already lack some of the resources that they need to be successful.
And you've mentioned Indigenous capital a couple times already, but what is the role of Indigenous capital in the transition to net zero, as we move to a decarbonized economy?
We have to look at what we mean by capital. There's a really excellent report out from RBC. I think it refers to Truth and Reconciliation Commission called Action 92 and the transition to a net zero economy. And they refer there to Indigenous capital, but not only capital in the sense financial capital, but intellectual capital, human capital, natural capital. The projects that we need to build to secure critical minerals, to ensure the transmission of electricity, are taking place on Indigenous lands. We need the Indigenous workforce to help build those projects. We need the benefits of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous community capacity to help advance the work that will be done to build projects in a good way. And we need to ensure that the intellectual capital that Indigenous peoples bring to projects is put at the forefront by helping Indigenous peoples to secure spaces in the decision-making rooms of the nation.
Okay, great, thank you. So Kakasha, first of all, am I saying that right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, great. So coming to you next, I know last week when we sort of chatted ahead of this, you were in Germany. Do you mind just telling us a little bit about that? You were there for a UN climate event. Can you tell us a little bit about that, the event that you were at?
Sure. So it was the 56th meeting of the subsidiary bodies of the UNFCCC, which is UN Climate, known as the Bonn Climate Summit, and they met after 3 years because the meetings kept getting postponed because of COVID-19. And these meetings generally serve as the precursor to the main climate change conference of this year. It's COP27, and there are a lot of important discussions that take place amongst member states to see how we can really move forward in ensuring that we address climate change in the way that it should be addressed, and particularly addressing the needs and wants of those who are most affected by climate change. So like some of the key points that really came out of that was first, of course, addressing the fact that we need to do a lot more in terms of implementation, because there is currently a lot of talk that is going on, a lot of discussions, but very little implementation. So really ensuring that governments kind of take the lead in that regard. And the second, the really important thing is addressing the loss and damage aspect, something that has been discussed in UN conferences for a very, very long time, but there still isn't adequate funding or any funding at all really dedicated towards addressing these needs and wants of those who are most vulnerable. So if we're really to talk about climate justice instead of just climate action, we need to address these very critical components of loss and damage and implementation, particularly something that, NGOs and civil society, we are doing, but really this meeting just put forward how important it is that governments and other stakeholders who are not just civil society also do their bit.
And is there any signaling about, what COP27 might focus on? I know last year covering it, there was a lot of focus on deforestation and about supporting the developing world in their efforts to defend against climate change. Is there any sense of what the upcoming summit will focus on?
Yeah. I think that now, since loss and damage, again, is like such a big topic of discussion, and just, not addressing the needs and wants of people after they've suffered from a climate disaster, but really providing them with the adequate tools and resources to protect themselves before the climate disaster hits. I mean, that is something that we as civil society are definitely calling on member states to discuss. And a lot of the least developed countries and those who fall under the high forest cover, low deforestation, HFLD countries and small island developing states, these are the states and the countries that are suffering as a result of the UNFCCC and the climate conference is not focusing enough on loss and damage. So definitely going into COP27, it's really about addressing moving towards climate justice and moreover intersectional climate justice, and addressing the very unique localized challenges that the impacts of climate change in different parts of the world.
Okay, and then just moving on to a little bit about Green Hope Foundation. Can you just share a bit more about what the foundation does and maybe some examples of some projects?
Sure. So I started my journey in the field of sustainability when I was 7, and I founded Green Hope Foundation when I was 12 years old because after attending the largest sustainable development conference of the time, Rio Plus 20, with 50,000 delegates, I saw that there were only 5 people under the age of 18, and overall there was a severe lack of inclusivity of children, young people, women, nations that should have been involved in the sustainable development process but weren't. So to address the severe lack of inclusivity, I founded Green Hope Foundation to really provide a platform of learning that turns into ground level action. So we at Green Hope Foundation work across 26 countries with over 300,000 people. The core of our work is education for sustainable development that then turns into ground level action. So, we focus on both developed and developing nations to address these very unique localized challenges that, for instance, climate change, biodiversity loss, all of the triple threat, environmental threats that poses to all of these countries. So for instance, we partner with school boards all across the world, so including in Canada with the Toronto District School Board, for instance, to provide environmental education to students to really ensure that they have that knowledge and understanding of why it's so important that they take care of their planet and their fellow human beings. We have a school in a rural community in Bangladesh called Green Hope Foundation's Academy of Hope for Women and Girls, which is solar powered and provides environmental justice education to the girls in the mornings and functions as a sewing school for women in the evenings for a sustainable source of income. We have planted over 800,000 indigenous fruit trees globally, over 10,000 mangroves. We do cleanups. We've conducted over 1,000 beach cleanups, canal cleanups, ravine cleanups, recycled over 3,300 tons of waste. In climate vulnerable communities, we have a concept called a solar powered mobile library that's taking books to the doorstep of thousands of out of school children as a result of climate change induced disasters and COVID-19 across Asia and Africa. We have now installed solar-powered irrigation systems called agrivoltaics that incorporates the dual use of land for both agriculture and energy. And this particularly enables women farmers to practice sustainable farming and attain socioeconomic security, so ensuring human rights and environmental justice. And our solar grids all across the world have an annual carbon offset of 4.5 million kgs of carbon dioxide.
Wow, that was a wide range of projects. Thank you for sharing. So James Skongak, we'll start with you. You are with Bruce Power, a power generator, and I just, obviously, you know, you guys have a central role to play here. So what strategies are you guys using to move toward net zero?
So just by way of background, our organization produces about a third of Ontario's electricity, and we've been on a multi-year investment program to be able to enable that. We're Canada's largest infrastructure project, and actually we're 70% of the additional energy that was needed to phase out coal-fired generation here in Ontario. So if you look, you know, there's not a smog day here in Toronto today. We don't see smog outside of the windows. 70% of that was from nuclear power from our site. We're committed, even though we're a very, we're obviously a clean source of electricity, we still, like any industrial operation, have what we call scope 1 and 2 emissions. So we are committed to being the first nuclear operator in the world to be net zero by 2027. So we're looking to reduce our emissions. We're investing in community-based offset projects. And you know, I think we just had a report released last week, and we're on track to achieve that. But more importantly, what we're focused on is how can we contribute to a net zero Canada and Ontario for 2030 and 2050 respectively.
Okay, and then, I mean, going back to some comments from Jesse, like we can't obviously embark on these changes without Indigenous engagement and participation. So what strategies can energy companies use to sort of be effective on that front, do you think? And Jesse, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, so our facility is located on the traditional territories of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation and the traditional harvesting territories of two Métis communities, and that is absolutely critical. And what I always say is, as an organization that has a long-term outlook, we want the next 50 years to look different than the last 50 years. That's got to be. And I always reflect on the 7 grandfather teachings, and I say, if you're an organization and you're thinking about what is the right thing to do, go back to those 7 grandfather teachings. And I think companies and organizations, you know, we can create Indigenous partnerships. Those can be partnerships in terms of investment in projects. We have one of our First Nation communities, the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, is actually an investor in one of our medical isotope production projects, which yesterday, by the way, as Canadians, we should be very proud. We were the first reactor in the world to be able to produce a short-lived isotope used to treat prostate cancer and tumors yesterday in partnership with the Sun. So I think those meaningful partnerships. I think also engaging and understanding what are some of the key interests and focus areas for the communities, whether that's are there certain environmental or traditional harvesting areas that are of interest, and dealing with those in a meaningful way. You know, I worry that in Canada we've got ourselves into a legalistic framework where you can spend more money on documenting all of this as opposed to doing the work. And in a partnership with an Indigenous community needs to be meaningful, and that means that, you know, you have to build trust. You're not going to have trust on day one. Trust is something that, frankly, because of all the history, it has been eroded over time, and we have to take the time to build that. But I think more broadly, as we think about net zero, I think the thing as Canadians, we need to also anchor ourselves on is, if writing policy papers determined the success of climate change or the fight against climate change, we'd be winning. We are losing. Policy papers do not solve climate change. Policy papers do not produce clean electricity. Policy papers do not get projects built. Policy papers do not put economic benefit in Indigenous people's communities. And so we can take a lot of comfort from policy papers. As somebody who, one of my responsibilities is related to the operation of our plant, we're generating clean electricity every day. I can't get a permit to do something until 2030, let alone fight climate change by 2030. Now, it's a bit of an exaggeration. But my point being is we need to separate out a conversation. Doing things more quickly to get clean energy projects online, that does not need to sacrifice the important work we need to do with Indigenous communities. And I think sometimes as companies, we can send, I think, a message that is counterproductive. Sometimes you need to go slower to go quicker, and taking that time with Indigenous communities, I think, will allow us to get projects moving faster. But we need our governments, federal, provincial, also looking at this in a pragmatic way as well. If they want to have clean electricity online for 2030, we need to look at areas like the Impact Assessment Act. We need to look at how do we administer those and make them practical.
And is that more federal or provincial or both?
Well, it's a bit unfair, and you were always great with us when you were in the minister's office. So we're a federally regulated entity, so I would say it's more federal. But I do think there's a real openness in Ottawa to say, look, we're not going to compromise our standards, and that nobody should. We wouldn't want that. But how do we do it in a more expeditious way, given the challenge? So in my case, it's more federal. That's just because we're federally regulated. But if you talk to a different utility that was provincially regulated, they would also have that. So it's everybody, and it's not any one party in power. It's not any one government. It's a generic collective challenge. And I sometimes think we cheapen the argument by making it a political issue. It's an issue all across society around the world. You can't get things built anymore. And that is a real challenge.
Jesse, did you want to add something?
Yeah, very briefly. So I'm from the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, and we help First Nations to understand and respond to major project infrastructure and where they're interested to get involved as partners, whether it's through benefits or revenue sharing or as equity partners. And some of the things we've seen that have been very successful is creating space at the decision-making table, having Indigenous representation on a board of directors. Number two, looking at equity opportunities. There's no greater understanding of free, prior, and informed consent than actually being a partner in the development itself as an equity owner. We had the benefit of hearing from our chair, Chief Charlene Gale, and she spoke to some of the benefits and opportunities to accelerate the transition to net zero through Indigenous partnerships. So we're seeing all of those things and finding it very difficult to make a case against the idea of Indigenous inclusion because it offers so many benefits in terms of moving things more quickly, building better projects, and helping to ensure that the decarbonized economy is inclusive.
James Larson, I know you're...
The other James.
The other James. So sort of looking outside Canada now and looking sort of to other countries, when we were chatting ahead of this event, you mentioned an interesting example from Chile that demonstrates the power of market forces, and I'm wondering if you can give a little bit of flavor from that now.
Yeah, certainly. So the context of our conversation was that there's a lot of things that are going to help drive our decarbonization agenda, and one of which is technology. And in the spirit of that, there's a supply and demand story, and really what we're talking about is the demand side. We have a tremendous adoption problem with technology. I run an energy storage company. I face this all the time. In Chile, it was quite interesting because in Chile they have a rising energy profile, so they have annual energy auctions. And my client there was a producer, a generator of electricity with coal and hydro. And what's interesting is that during each of these auctions, there would be a variety of different energy players at that auction bidding in solar or wind or coal or hydro, whatever. And traditionally, it's just always been coal and hydro because that's always been the cheapest. Basically, consistently at $60 a megawatt hour. And the first time solar and wind really competed in that market was around 2013. They were around 120, and then in 2014 they were around 105, and they slowly dipped down. And they weren't winning any projects. They were winning some projects just on the margins. But what's interesting is that in 2016, it was at $48 a megawatt hour. And guess what happened? 0 coal and hydro projects for my client, and 100% of the projects awarded were solar and wind. So it was the market forces of the price and the economics that drove the entire agenda there. And it's interesting because it's a harbinger of what's to come, in a good way, though, right? Because in Chile, the dynamics are slightly different. They have the Atacama Desert, so they've got really cheap solar. They've got high wind resources in Patagonia. And fossil fuels are expensive because they import. But in Canada, it's a little bit different, and so we have yet to reach that parity point. But when we do, it will be demonstrable, right? The transition will drastically accelerate. But what we need is the private investment to drive that and to really push that forward. So we can talk about policy and all that sort of stuff, which is important, but we really need the private sector to invest and act.
And yeah, I think now is probably a good time for you to just tell us like a little bit more about what eZinc actually does. In terms of, you know, one of the biggest barriers from moving away from fossil fuels is energy storage and having a reliable source of energy across more than just hours. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what the company does and your approach.
Sure, my pleasure. So eZinc is a Toronto-based energy storage technology developer, and we have a proprietary zinc-based solution that's focused on long-duration applications. So whereas batteries like lithium-ion or lead-acid would be focused on multi-hour duration storage, we're focused on multi-day duration storage. And the significance of that is that if you extrapolate out what we're trying to do and decarbonize, we need a fully renewable future. As we proliferate solar and wind on the grid, no longer can we rely on base load resources, no longer can we rely on short duration technologies. We need long duration storage to be able to balance out the intermittency of solar and wind. So this is a tidal wave coming, and the market knows it. There's a long duration energy storage council that was put together by McKinsey and a number of players, of which we're part of, that's talking about trillions of investment and terawatts of power. Like those, they're just staggering figures. And we know it's coming, and so we intend to be one of the companies that addresses that.
And maybe James Skongak, you can just jump in, because I'm actually working on a story right now about electric vehicles and electrification of transportation. And one thing that has, the story itself will be about charging infrastructure, but one thing that sort of keeps coming up is the extent to which, you know, our power grids can actually sustain a fully electrified or even more so electrified fleet over time. So I know, James Larson, you're talking about developing some storage, which could obviously help with that. But in the sort of nearer term or medium term, how do you think about that?
So is this an off-the-record comment?
Will not be on the front page of tomorrow's Globe and Mail.
Well, I don't know about that. It should be on the front page. No,
it's being recorded.
I'm teasing. No, and I look, the system isn't ready for a net zero transition, right? So the great thing, and I better be careful about saying this, the thing about fossil fuels is they're very flexible. But we can't rely on fossil fuels anymore because it's contributing to climate change. And so the problem is we have a system that is built that assumes your generation is very flexible. We need to remove that flexibility, like we did in Ontario with coal. So it's really, I look at electrification, I look at storage, as all of these areas are essential contributors to the full picture. You can't look at any one element in isolation. A grid an electricity system has to be redundant. Right? We need to know that if one generating source doesn't, you know, I come from the Grey Bruce region and they call it Grey County for a reason. I wouldn't rely on solar power in Grey County in January. Doesn't mean we don't need solar power. We need a redundant system. So when we look at EVs, no, our electricity system is not designed for that. Our electricity system is designed to put electricity in people's houses.
Yeah.
So we need to build the mechanisms where local distribution companies can build out that infrastructure. But electrification in vehicles can also be a form of storage. You're taking electricity that can be plugged in the evening and plug into the day. But I do think in the storage discussion, we need to forget that, you know, I'm very proud of Canada's nuclear industry, but one of the major successes in Canada is our hydroelectric sector. We are a hydroelectric superpower. You go across Canadian provinces. What is one of the most proven, reliable forms of energy storage? Hydropower, right? We don't need to import lithium from China to do pump storage, and I'm not critical of that, but we need diversity. You know, and if I look at, for example, in our backyard, there's one project by TC Energy. They're looking to build a 1,000 megawatt pump storage facility. That's enough electricity for 1 million homes over 12 hours. And a pump storage, pump water up a hill, when you need it, you run it down a hill. I'll take that reliability. It's what Niagara Falls does every day. Combined with battery storage, combined with renewables. A lot of this is on Indigenous traditional territory, and what a great opportunity to drive that economic benefit. And look, we have Indigenous communities in Canada. We talk about getting Indigenous communities in the north off diesel, which I totally agree with, because diesel is just terrible for the environment. These are communities that don't have running water. So when we talk about growing economic prosperity in these communities, we may fundamentally change people's way of life. If the revenues that come from some of this resource development can get people on clean water, basic things that many of us here take for granted, it's a game changer. But we're not going to do that through policy papers. We're going to do it through private sector investment, going with what's proven, and we can't get myopic on one solution. We have to recognize we need redundancy. There's going to be times where people prefer one solution over another. We need it all.
Maybe I should, I'll reach out to you for my story.
Please do, and I'll do it on the record.
I'll get you on the record. Yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to comment on the technical challenge of what you're talking about, because there's a lot of discourse about the electrification of our vehicle fleet. We need to do it, right? It's one of the big things. There's two really big challenges, though, right? Interestingly, a lot of people talk about the supply of electricity, but we actually have lots of electricity. It's not really around an electricity supply issue. The first thing is, when we talk about using EVs as a flexible resource, I have a hard time imagining that it's going to be that way, because I think about myself as a consumer, and if you're telling me that you're going to use my battery in my car as a storage mechanism, and you're going to charge and discharge it and perhaps void the warranty of it, or I'm going to get in my car and it's going to be empty because you just drained it because you need it for the grid, I think there's going to be a lot of consumer resistance to that. So I think that's one big challenge. The second big challenge, this is a really big challenge, is the actual infrastructure we have, the grid, the interconnection at the grid points. When we talk about having massive EV charging networks, the grid's not set up for that, right? And so what it'll actually require, I believe, and our team's hypothesis would be DC-based microgrids where you're actually solving this behind the meter. And so ironically, you'd actually need more storage to be able to help facilitate that.
I maybe misunderstood when you were saying as a form of storage. I was maybe thinking of it in too simplistic terms, where maybe you could draw from the grid at an off-peak time, store it in your battery for when you need it in your own car, as opposed to charging your car at a peak
exactly
time.
Right. If you think about today, when are we going to use the most electricity today? From when everybody wakes up in the morning to when they go to bed, demand's going to go up like this. Well, typically in a fossil, whether it's coal or natural gas, what do? You have your base load and use your fossil assets to dispatch up and dispatch down. We don't want to do that anymore. So what we need to do is build our clean resources up to this, and we're always running at that. And in the evening, when you don't need that power, you use it to store to charge your vehicle, to charge your battery storage, to pump that water uphill for pump storage. It's pretty simple, but the problem electricity system operators have is they love fossil fuels. Because if you're just looking at pure reliability and you just look at it, fossil fuels give you a lot of that flexibility. And so it's not a reason to stick with fossil fuels, we need out of it, but to recognize any move away from that is fundamentally more complex than where we are today. Yeah. But also opens up a whole new economy of opportunities and innovation. But that's why we need all the above. And remember, there's different regions of our province and our country that have different demands. Air conditioning load in an area like the 416 here may be a lot higher than an area of northern Ontario where the heating load is. So there's also geographic differences, right? Quebec's peak for electricity is in the winter. Our peak for electricity in Ontario is in the summer. So we also need to look at that, and not any market is not, building a solar plant in South America makes a heck of a lot more sense, like you guys have done, than it does in rural Ontario. Right? And that's where we need to think about what technology for what application. Engineers love this stuff, right? Because it means they get to play in everything.
Kakasha, we haven't forgotten about you. I know you're virtual, but I just wanted to loop you back in. I know you take like a more global view, obviously, of climate change, or at least the projects are more global in scope. So do you have a view on, who the winners and losers will be with regard to climate impacts? And also kind of related to that, what do you think is Canada's role in contributing to the response on a more global level?
For sure. Well, I don't think there's going to be any winners in terms of climate impacts. Like we're seeing right now with climate change and the way it's affecting global north and global south, that we're all losers in this regard unless and until we actually do something to address it. So I think James mentioned a term, that myopia, which I think that the global north particularly has been afflicted with for a really long time, where we kind of just thought that, it's climate change is affecting countries in the global south, it's not affecting us, and that is why, there's nothing we can really do about it, even though we're the ones really contributing to climate change. But right now, we are really feeling the impacts of climate change firsthand. So it's not some faraway issue anymore, and it's not just something that's relegated to simply graphs and data on a piece of paper. It is something that is very, very tangible, and it is destroying people's lives in the global north as well. So I think that in terms of that, we need to really come together as one society to be able to address these impacts of climate change. And yes, as you said, that my work is very global, but we also recognize how important it is to localize, understand the localized challenges and localize our solutions as well. And here, I think that Canada can play a very, very important role. I've already seen, at these climate change conferences and at all of these other high-level discussions, Canada does a lot more than a lot of the other developed countries in terms of advocating for just transition and, actually implementing a lot of the things that they talk about. Of course, there's a lot more that Canada can do, but just in comparison to other superpowers, Canada does do a lot. And particularly, I think Canada can play a very important role in advocating the importance of localization. I think my fellow panelists already spoke about, how our different provinces and their different regions have different needs. And if we just scale that up to the global arena as well, it's really important that Canada takes that leadership role in helping especially other developed nations, to understand that it's very important to address these very, very local challenges and local impacts of climate change. So I think that Canada can play a very big leadership role. They're already doing that in a lot of climate change talks, but there's a lot more that can be done. And the final thing that I would say is just greater multi-stakeholder partnership. I think that it's really important that we bring all of these unique voices and perspectives to the table to really have that holistic, all-round, well-rounded view of what we can do to address climate change. And once we really put our heads together and discuss and implement these solutions, we will be able to create a society, not just in Canada, but globally as well, that really works towards climate justice and acts on the adage that prevention is better than cure. So not just talking about adaptation, but really moving on the mitigation side as well, and protecting people and planet in that regard.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, and just sort of on that note of leadership, Jesse, coming back to you, you've talked about, we all have heard of ESG, it's talked about in pretty much every boardroom, but you've talked about ESGI, which is maybe a term that doesn't have quite as much traction, so maybe you can just loop us in on kind of exactly what that means to you.
Certainly. So environmental, social, and governance factors are driving a lot of international investment. Where does the capital go? We heard Martha Hall-Finley talk about, is capital leaving Canada or is it coming into Canada? And through the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, one of the things we've investigated is how are Indigenous people fitting into this structure, ESG. And what we've found, Global Reporting Initiative, others, they've been developed without the participation of Indigenous peoples. And the metrics that are being applied to decide where sustainability investments go aren't fully considering the impacts on Indigenous peoples. So we've been advocates, along with many others, for greater inclusion of Indigenous considerations in environmental, social, and governance considerations. And what does that look like? That looks like measurable, transparent, verifiable assessments that can be applied by investors to determine if this is where they want to invest their money or if they want it to go somewhere else. And it ties into this idea that having Indigenous peoples at the table, whether as equity participants or supporters of projects, helps to accelerate and de-risk projects and enhances the likelihood that they're going to get built and going to get built on time. I think also within that space is consideration of Indigenous rights and the implementation of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. After I left Catherine McKenna's office, I ended up spending some time with David Lametti as he was the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, still is, and I had the privilege of helping him in the development of C-15, which was the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And we need to operationalize that. And I think about it in the context of James' work and the Nuclear Waste Management Organization and functionally applying free, prior, and informed consent to say to Indigenous communities where projects might be cited for the long-term maintenance of spent fuels. We're going to do this with you. We're not going to do it without you. And if we start bringing those considerations into the investment discussions, we're going to see greater capital coming into Canada. We're going to see greater partnerships with Indigenous peoples, and we're going to see the projects that need to be built to transition to a net zero economy being built quickly and being built on budget.
Okay, great. I feel like it would be, I have a couple more questions, but I feel like it would be great to turn it to you guys, and I feel bad because there's all those people over on that side behind the podium.
By the way, that gentleman that raised the nuclear power question last time, I did not buy him lunch today.
Oh.
but I agreed with about 80% of what he said. Sorry, 100%.
Are there any questions from anyone in the room? And if not, we can go virtual, but okay. We can go to our virtual audience, which is, where am I? Somebody over there?
I think it's the mic over there.
Yeah, a question from the virtual audience. What sectors in Canada, from a business point of view, would you say are moving faster on some of this stuff?
Is there anyone who wants to take that in terms of which sectors are doing a particularly good job, I guess?
You mean in what context? From an Indigenous engagement perspective or move to net zero?
I think it was probably more broad on the move to net zero. And if we can't think of other sectors, maybe other countries, like I know we had the good example from Chile, but if there's other case study examples that you guys find interesting?
Well, not to be overly patriotic here, but if I look at what Ontario has done, Ontario moved from an electricity system that relied on over a quarter of our power from coal-fired generation to 0% coal-fired generation today in just over a decade. And sometimes, the governor of California flies in or the chancellor of Germany and we do a big photo op on, look at what Ontario's done. Like a lot of times we forget what we've done here in Canada. Look at our deeply decarbonized electricity system. So firstly, I think Canada from an electricity perspective has been exceptional. And I get concerned sometimes when you have targets like 2050, 2050 is closer than you think. And sometimes we're always looking for that shiny object. The truth is, for the immediate needs we have, we need to look at what has worked and get going on that. It doesn't prevent us from doing more of these innovative elements. But, so I would say Canada has a very good foundation from an electricity system. I mean, we're one of the most decarbonized electricity systems in the world, which gives you that foundation. So, I give a shout out to Canada on it. That's not in an arrogant way saying there isn't a lot more to do. But I think Canada has really done a lot of heavy lifting in there, and I wish we would talk about it more and utilize that history and that experience more.
Right, and I guess it depends on where you live, depending on how clean the...
Well, no, I mean, at the end of the day, if I go through the only two, if I go through British Columbia, you go through British Columbia, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, right, Newfoundland, Labrador.
Skipped a couple.
Right, but I'm talking about if you look at the population of Canada, 36 million people, in a collective of province that represent 30 million of the 36 million Canadians, they are an electricity system that's almost 0%. Yeah, that's pretty impressive. Now there's more to do.
Yeah.
Could I throw in on that
Sure.
as well? Just a nod towards electricity and transmission specifically, and a pat on the back to Hydro One that has been making some significant moves in creating space for Indigenous equity involvement in some of the transmission infrastructure that's to be developed in Ontario. My First Nation Chippewas of the Thames, Deshkan-Zibing, we've got transmission cutting right through the reserve. And it's always been an imposition. It's something that was put there by other people that takes up some of our reserve space. It's not ours. I would love to take my kids out in front of the school there one day and point up to the transmission infrastructure and say, we own that, or we own parts of that. That is something that is there generating revenues that are making our community stronger. So we're seeing it in the transmission space. And And I think that's going to be an accelerator both for the speed at which the transmission that we need to enhance the macrogrid is being built, and also a major contribution to economic reconciliation in Canada.
And James, did you have anything you want to add? I know on the call you talked a lot about, a private sector needing to be sort of at the fore. So I don't know if you have examples maybe or sector specific.
Well, I think if I can call it a sector, I would actually like to give a shout out to the innovation sector, because everyone should really know and be very proud about how much is being done in terms of innovation in Canada. It's really impressive. Just to throw out a statistic, there's an annual list of the top 100 clean tech companies in the world, and there's 13 companies from Canada on that list. So we're 1/7 of the list from one country, which is ours. Right? Everything from helping decarbonize by pumping CO2 into concrete to doing energy storage, software solutions, across the board, right? So something we should be really proud of. We're doing a heck of a lot to innovate, and it's being recognized on a global stage.
Is there one more question virtually, or not so much?
Yeah, we have someone asking, BC tends to lead in the areas of First Nations new governance models, advanced educational opportunities, and environmental leadership, largely because of unresolved treaties. Where do you see the leaders and laggards regionally across the country?
Leaders and laggards. Well, I certainly hold up my hands to the First Nation leadership in terms of the work that they're doing, sometimes with limited resources, sometimes under immense pressures and challenges to stand up for their communities, to create educational opportunities, to do that work. What we're seeing is a need growing in the broader Canadian economy for labor and talented labor. And demographically, First Nations are some of the most young and available communities of potential workforce that could be utilized in the country. So where we are seeing leadership is where corporate Canada is picking up the puck and skating down the ice to bring Indigenous peoples into the training and participation that will allow the opportunity to harness that workforce, but also create economic development opportunities for First Nations. So it's distributed across the country, but it's exceptionally important that we get to work now in terms of creating opportunities for Indigenous training in Canada.
Okay, we've got a minute and 30 seconds left, so maybe each of you can, 30 seconds each, say whatever you want. What did I miss?
A thank you for bringing us into this room. The First Nations Major Projects Coalition is trying very hard to help improve the lives of Indigenous peoples in Canada through economic development for Indigenous communities, and being part of these discussions is an important part of that work. So thank you to the Globe and Mail and to yourself for creating space for us.
Thanks for being here. And
so
James,
yeah, thank the Globe and Mail as well. I think there's very thoughtful coverage and analysis on this topic, when oftentimes it's not, I think it's very good journalism and reporting. Two very quick things. First is Indigenous participation makes a project stronger, and we have to look at it that way. Everybody wins. And the second thing is, next time somebody tells you that we're making progress on net zero, ask them to go show you what project is underway that's going to deliver that clean energy. Go see it. If we don't see it getting built, we're not making progress. And that's got to be the challenge.
Obviously, certainly a thank you, but I would just say there's a lot of reasons for us to be very hopeful. We have very ambitious targets, but there's an immense amount of work being done across sectors, from the innovation side, from the public side of things, the public sector, the private sector, and there's a lot of reasons to believe we can achieve what we want to.
Okay, and Kakasha, 20 seconds, because I forgot.
Be on TV.
You're on TV, you're there, yeah.
Sure. So I firmly believe that by making the right choices today without further delay, it's not too late to shape the major trends of our time in a direction that is sustainable, and each individual organization, community sector has a role to play in really moving this just transition forward. And that's really your mantra at Green Hope Foundation. So yes, I'm very glad that we're having this discussion today. And I am sure that with taking this forward and understanding that we all have a role to play, I truly believe that we can come together and mitigate climate change and create a sustainable world for all, where no one is left behind.
All right, on that positive note, thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I don't know. I think we just go now.
Good discussion.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
So,
Thanks so much.
you guys knew each other before?
Thanks, Catherine, and hi, everyone. My name is Matt Lundy. I'm an economics reporter here at the Globe and Mail. To close out today's event, we'll be exploring innovation in Canada. Our nation currently lags many developed countries in GDP growth and productivity, though we certainly have the right building blocks to change that. To talk about the issue today, we have Dan Bresnitz here, professor and Munk Chair of Innovation Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Earlier this month, Dan won the Donner Prize for Best Public Policy Book in the country. That book, Innovation in Real Places, Strategies for Prosperity in an Unforgiving World, challenges Canada's current approaches to growth and innovation. He currently serves as the Clifford Clark Visiting Economist at the Canadian Department of Finance, where he's responsible for bringing new economic thinking to the government. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you for having me.
To get started here, just so that everyone's on the right page, I thought it might be good for us to define exactly, when we talk about productivity, what are we talking about and why is it so important to the nation's future?
So let's talk about both innovation and productivity first. So the first thing is productivity, basically speaking. Is that okay? I sound to myself horrible. So is this working? Good. Productivity is basically, very simply, how much? Yeah. See, innovation, IT, productivity, they all work for us today. Productivity is basically what you can achieve with a certain units that you bring in, humans, equipment, whatever. You mix them together, and you get X. The more productive you are, the more you can do with the same units. Innovation is the only way in which you can, A, enhance productivity, but also, and that at least as importantly, come up with new products and services, but also enhance human welfare, right? None of us would sit here if we haven't figured out how to deal with Corona, for example. What we have in Canada is sharply declining productivity for many years, and year by year decrease of, forget innovation in the business sector, engagement with new technology and innovation. So to understand why this is a problem, we just had a whole panels about we are going to become net zero and clean tech. There is no way we will ever become green if our businesses don't engage with new technologies, by definition. Forget being a green leader. So if we don't solve that, that's not an option we are having. The second, for 46 years, the median wage of Canadian is the same. The only way we actually have a reasonable, actually quite good life, let's be honest, right, compared to the rest of the world, but the same as we have as our parents, is because current Canadians work harder and longer, and both partners, if you have a household, work. It's not because we are more productive, and this is happening when Canadians are more educated than ever before. As a matter of fact, we have probably the most educated workforce in the world. And achieving almost zero productivity with the most educated labor force in the world should be a massive alarm for all of us.
Mm-hmm. So in the lead up to the last federal budget we had a few months ago, we had a lot of corporate leaders across Canada who were talking about how they wanted to see a pro-growth agenda, that we weren't taking things seriously enough as a country, that we weren't thinking on a long-term basis. What did you make of that discussion? Did anything constructive come out of it?
Well, first I want to say the good thing, and that is it's nice to see that private business in Canada actually use the word productivity, and that the government also use the word productivity. The rest, productivity happens in the private business sector. So when I see the CEOs of Canada's best companies, which again have access to the best human capital in the world, complain that they can't figure out long-term strategy and that our productivity is very low, my first reaction is, and what are you doing in your companies? Why do you expect the government to tell you how to be more productive so you can have more profits? Something is weird in even stating that. So what I would urge them to do, if you're really serious about productivity and long-term growth, become leaders instead of saying that this is a problem.
Mm-hmm. So I think you had mentioned earlier that business investment has, as a share of GDP, has been declining for quite a while, decades. Why is that?
I think because they can look at the profits and the profits share as a part of GDP, and you have an answer. Mm-hmm. They are making money. And you should expect that what business care about is not to make Canada a lovely country. I mean, that's a side issue, they might. But businesses care about making money and profits. And they care, and I think that's the most important thing that people don't understand about innovation. They don't care about innovation. They care about being able to stay profitable with a minimum amount of risk and uncertainty. And if that means, by definition, investing less in innovation, capital, new technology change, that's what they will do. And in Canada, and that's a big failure of the government, multiple failures for multiple years, we create a market framework which allow that to happen. So Canadian business can become less and less sophisticated and still make money. Our competition, as I'm sure you know, because you pay mobile telephony bills just like me, is not very high. And the government completely and utterly ignored the fact that if you go, any one of you would go to a good university, Economics of Innovation 101, the first thing you will hear that under free market conditions, society will have less innovation than the social optimum because it doesn't make sense for business and entrepreneur to do that unless you fix that market failure. And since '96, we have been in complete denial that that's what we have to do as a government. So the outcome we have now should have been the expected outcome, not a massive surprise that everybody looks around as, how did it happen? It happened because we made the wrong policy choice and the wrong changes vis-a-vis the changing global economy. Very simple.
So on that note, there was just 2 lines of your book that I thought really stood out here. It goes, the more the Canadian government has invested taxpayers' money in trying to spur innovation, the less Canadian private businesses have done so. Canada easily wins the Wooden Spoon Award for the worst innovation policy among all developed economies. How do we change that? You're working for the government now, right?
I should have not written that just before accepting that role in government. By the way, people told me I'm wrong. Maybe New Zealand can compete with us, but yes. How do we change that? First, and I think that's actually, so first let's be slightly positive, okay? We have the most highly educated labor force in the world. We have probably the most effective, if you look at invention and research, not innovation, public research sector in the world, which are 2 necessary conditions in order to excel. What we don't have, and we have not admitted, just like an alcoholist, the first step is to admit you have a problem. We have been in denial for 21 years that we have a problem, even when everybody who looked at graph, and probably there's 1,000 Globe and Mail articles that says that our business investment in R&D is going down, nobody said, okay, that's a problem we should actually fix, and that the problem is the business sector. Instead, we had lovely programs that tried to squeeze the university to do something. Another program on really, really high-end R&D, zero thinking about how that turns into commercial. Zero thinking about why Canadian companies, let's not assume that managers are stupid or uneducated. Why are they choosing to follow those strategies? How can we change a business framework, both, sticks and but also carrots, so they will change that behavior and start to engage more in innovation? I think we only now start to really do that, and I hope there will be change.
I wanted to talk a little bit about solutions. So we're lagging other countries here. Who's doing a good job or a better job than us, and what can we learn from them?
So let me give 2 examples that are also in the budget. And they're in the budget for a reason, and that's Israel, which I think a lot of people heard about, how great they are. There's also significant limitation to Israel, and that's unbelievably growing inequality, which we don't want to have. Yeah. But the other is also Finland. And if you look at the world, and the reason Finland and Israel are there, because if you look at where we are at BARD, business R&D, and investment engagement of our business sector with new technologies, we are extremely similar to where Israel and Finland, so rock bottom of the OECD, when they decided that this is a problem and started policies. Okay, number 1. Both are also extremely successful. And in both cases, everybody will say, that's state-led, that's transformation. Finland, again, looking at the world, is another north country called, really big, not a lot of people compared to the landmass, completely reliant on trade with a former superpower, which that trade led it to become less and less sophisticated. And now what Finland has done is not only created new high-tech industries like Israel, but completely revamped its resource and energy base and everything that, if you look at Canada, should be our competitive advantage. Both of them have done that through the creation of, let's call it arm's length or independent agency, which had one mission. And that one mission was fix that dumb market failure. It wasn't written that way. It was maximize R&D innovation in the economy, usually leading to exports, right? Because you want your companies and entrepreneurs to compete with the best, not to, okay, I sell $4 million in Ontario, I have a great cottage and 2 boats, goodbye, but really compete with the best. And that's what they have done, and it takes about 5 years, and then you see a growth. Once you see the growth, people say, oh, you can actually make money doing that, and more people join, and more people join, and more people join. And that should be the role of government, fixing market failure, fixing coordination problem, fixing collective action problem, helping business to, take risk and deal with uncertainty, changing regulations, which we are not doing. Right? We are really good in the fundamentals, so basic science, human capital, all the rest. Anything that has to do with a market, we seem to believe in free market more than my friends in the University of Chicago, and I think it's time to change that and actually go back to reality.
Any year, like when we look at a budget, there are tons of announcements that are aimed at increasing innovation, and I remember one year, maybe it was like 3 years ago, the word innovation was mentioned like 100 or 200 times in the budget. So it's clearly on the radar of the federal government. What are some of those programs that they've come out with that maybe didn't land quite as successfully, and why was that?
I think a lot of a program, and again, I think much of a problem we had for the last 20 years is we conflated innovation with invention. So let me give a concrete example. If your program aims to create new artificial intelligence technologies or quantum computing, but there's 0 in the program that explain how that translates to either new products and services in existing Canadian businesses, not foreign ones, and or new companies, this is not an innovation policy. This is research policy, this is invention policy, this is something that looks good in the budget, but it's not innovation policy. And it's not even an attempt to tackle the real problem we have, which is a systematic lowering of business engagement with innovation. And we are completely, or have been completely in love with invention. Even admitting that our business sector might be part of a problem was a big no-no. I think that if you read what our Minister of Finance, Chrystia, has said when she put that budget, I think this is the first time any Minister of Finance used the word productivity for more than 20 years, and actually admitted that we have a problem. So I hope this is changing. Can I promise you that it's changing? No, but I wouldn't have agreed to stay for another 6 months if I didn't think there's hope.
I think that's a good point. You mentioned that, sometimes when we think of innovation, we think about the tech industry or Silicon Valley. What does innovation look like? What are some success stories you can point to in other industries that have been especially innovative, whether it's in Canada or elsewhere? I know there's a million examples in your book.
Sure. So let's talk about what innovation. So, and I'll try to be very simple. But what's the difference between invention and innovation? So invention is the act of coming up with a new idea. Innovation is actually taking ideas and making them into new products or services all across a production. So from coming up with completely new services and products to making those products good. So the fact that we now all use Zoom and we don't even think that it's costless and it's good. Think about 20 years ago, if we needed to do that and we were told that we have to do it in telecommunication, we would do everything in our power not to do that, because you and I will have to find a specialized room that costs millions of dollars, and all those people will suffer a horrific experience. Now, it's like a light. And that's when that technology completely changed our life when COVID hit. It's not when somebody invented the idea of teleconferencing 40 years ago. It's the hundreds of millions of engineering hours that made all those technologies, memory, data compression, video, so good that we now don't even think about this as being unnatural. And that's, I think, what's important. So that's one example. Another example from telecommunication could be the supercomputer that you have in your pocket, probably iPhone, I guess. If you think about what was a smartphone in your parents' time, it was a wooden box, a huge one, on the wall, and you needed to roll or call somebody, ask him or her to, if they can find somebody else who also have a wooden box, and maybe you can actually do voice. What you have here, 15 or 20 years ago, would be under export control of the United States DoD, because you can easily use, and people have been using the iPhones to run ballistic missiles.
This is a very different example, but in your book, you mention a place not too far from here, Hamilton, 30 or 45 minutes down the road. Rust Belt city, declining manufacturing employment, but a place that is perhaps, you could easily argue, a lot more vibrant than it was a couple of decades ago. How much of that was luck versus, say, proximity to Toronto versus actual planning from people?
So in all the cases of success, and if I'll bring policymakers from Finland and Israel or Taiwan, and they tell you that they knew in advance what they're doing, no, they knew how to make the right choice to be ready for luck when it comes, okay? Hamilton did the same. I think the proximity to Toronto was important, but not in that way, and I'll explain. Let's look at health sciences, where a lot of what's good in Hamilton is happening now. Hamilton and McMaster had to establish a medical school very late in the game, right next to already established, unbelievably successful medical school in Toronto. So the way they differentiate themselves is by figuring out how to teach medicine in a completely different way. Figuring out how to look at medicine in a different way, what we now called evidence-based medicine, and now we call it evidence-based policy and evidence-based blah, 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 blah. All of it, if you actually look, which is one of the most important innovation in medicine, come from McMaster School of Medicine. And it comes from McMaster School of Medicine because that school was willing to experiment and needed to try it in a different way, because here you have a University of Toronto that already was the established mainstream. So if you wanted to compete, you needed to do it in a different way. That competition now leads to a whole series of innovation in population data. I'm not sure you're in the right age, but soon you might, and you will take a mini aspirin. All that research is directly from McMaster, and the fact that they started to figure out how to look at medicine in a different way. And I personally think it's a great success. I know that here people in Toronto, like me, try to look at Hamilton like. But in this field, we have a lot to learn from them.
When we spoke before this, you may have described yourself as a hopeful cynic or something like that. Given how far behind we are, a lot of peer countries in productivity growth, what gives you hope that we can sort of right the ship here?
So let me repeat. We have the best people in the world, and we should be aware of that. And if you allow the best people in the world to excel, amazing thing will happen. So the question is really, how do you allow Canadians to excel? And we already know, by the way, there's multiple examples that when you allow them to do that, they do excel, preferably inside Canada and not in the United States. But even in Canada, we have, BlackBerry, Ream, Shopify, others. We can go in almost every sector. If we manage not to have one in every 10 years, but 10 in every year in each and every sector, that will be amazing. And that's something which is completely feasible. We have the right people, we have the money, we are rich, we are resource rich, we have variance in our country, so we can have a multiple experiment and see what actually work. We just need to decide that that's what we want and focus on that not for 2 years, but for 5 or 10 or 15 until we make it happen.
And to drive it home, if we have 10 Shopifys every year in every sector, what does that mean for the average Canadian?
So if it's in every sector, and that's really important because Shopify employs only very specific kind of people, but if it's in every sector, what does that mean is that, first of all, the quality of jobs for people, Canadian, working in every one of those sectors is vastly increased. So right now we have the most educated, creative people working with technologies and equipment of 15 years ago. It's horrible jobs. So that's important. Productivity will go up with it. Wages will go up with it. Taxes goes up with that. Infrastructure goes up with that. Everything that we care about go up instead of stagnant.
I'd like to open it up to some individuals here. We'll make sure we can get maybe a microphone. Is anyone able to do that?
You got a microphone.
Yeah, here we go.
Creative thinking, my compliments. Governance is inherently conservative in terms of traction. And for the last 40 years, the governance system in Canada has been basically seeking to maintain the status quo. Election, re-election, election, re-election, and rhetoric. You are attempting to tilt the zeitgeist in terms of what I call critical refractive thinking, which scares many people who have a comfort zone. What they don't know, they tend to push away. And what they don't understand, they do not even want to try to deal with this. And what you're saying is inherently responsible, but how is it that you can motivate and inspire an individual to say, I may lose the government, I may lose the election, but I'm going to start the conversation, and hopefully someone else will pick it up and further it. Thank you.
I think. Go for it, yeah.
Okay, so first, I actually think that we should think, I don't know if we should think, but there's good things in COVID, and that is that it put a mirror. And it put a mirror that made a lot of people realize that we have a problem, right? Up until that point, Canada really was, as you just described, the frog in a pot of slowly boiling water, in complete denial that it's not just warm and easy, but we're actually dying. COVID was like a mirror in our face showing all our failures. And with COVID comes geopolitical changes. And with them come an opening, and now we have inflation and crisis, so people are slightly outside of a comfort zone. Second, after 21 years, even those that don't want to look at that mirror realize that the things they care about in order to get reelected, so in this case, the middle class and greening the economy, are not going to happen. And that, once, this is not innovation, it's some abstract good, but it's Canadian middle classes, meaning voters, and green tech ain't going to happen unless we change. We start to rethink. The second is, and that's where you have to understand, and that's why Finland and Israel succeeded and we have not. They have understood that you need to take it outside the political cycle, partly because you cannot expect either a civil servant who is entrusted with public money, but especially a politician, to experiment, because an experiment means that you're going to have a lot of failures. And that's why they have created those agencies which are arm's length, actually allowed to bring business people. The government has influence but not direct control. So when they fail, and they fail quite often, it's okay, because it's not me, Minister X, that failed. And here I can now say, oh, we failed, it's actually even good, or do something about it, but it doesn't come to me. It's not me that have to put all my career on the line for one policy. And we have to start to understand that. And I think we have a window of opportunity to then institutionalize experiment, and I know I'm using horrible words, but still, so the politicians can do it once and minimize the risk to themselves. If we do it right, it would be a slow change, but there is hope. If we fail, even in this time, to actually do that, I'm going back to the University of Toronto. I have a very nice office. I'll start writing papers again. And
we have about 3 minutes left. Okay, we have a question here.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for the presentation. My name is Azim Leela. I'm with CIBC Digital. I like the vision around building 10 unicorns per year. I know the Globe and Mail and others have written about startup culture in Toronto and Canada. We have an abundance of startups. The issue that we're inherently hitting is that we're not able to scale up fast enough. So lots of companies just sell out. And so we're good at starting companies, I'm going to argue, but it's where we have trouble scaling, and we don't have the homegrown talent to scale globally. And that's a critique, but maybe that's an opportunity.
So, yes, I agree. I would even go one further, and I'll explain in a minute. But I want to make sure one thing that it's important. Our game should not be only new startups and unicorn. It should be innovation in all sectors. Because there's more to Canada than Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal and software. We have resource-based industries, we have agriculture, we have supposedly a lot of critical minerals, and we can do things with them that are not just taking them out of the ground and shipping them as fast as possible to the United States. If we manage to do both your unicorns and changing those sectors, or having unicorn in those sectors, not just unicorn based on a completely new technology, then I'll be I think all Canadians will enjoy it, and I will be very proud at us. As terms of scale-ups, I completely agree. We need to change it. It's a problem of finance, it's a problem of opportunity, it's a problem of regulation. It's even worse than what you think, because we are supposed to have that talent. When in a working ecosystem, a company like REEM, BlackBerry, comes down, you have hundreds of companies coming out, of which 10 becomes really successful. In Canada, our ecosystem was so bad that I'm willing to bet that within 5 years after REEM went down, all the management team below Jim Balsillie left the country. And that's striking and quite frightening if we don't manage to change that.
Well, we're just about out of time here. I wanted to thank Dan for being with us today and speaking. If you have any other questions for Dan, maybe you can corner him on his way out the building. But so that concludes our event. I'd like to thank all of you for coming today, whether in the room or virtual. I'd also like to thank the other excellent speakers that we had today, along with our event partners, which include Google, Bruce Power, and Northland Power. Thank you for making this event possible. And of course, we have snacks and drinks, and people can network there, so hang out for a while. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.